everyone. So, when we think of someone recovering from trauma or mental illness, we often assume that their recovery will have a positive effect on everyone else. Maybe they won't lash out as much. Maybe they'll be able to manage their relationships better. Maybe they'll be more able to do fun things with people because their anxiety won't be holding them back so much. But it's important to recognize that while your recovery can benefit other people, it can also make other people upset or disappointed with you. And if that happens, it's still okay for you to pursue the recovery journey, regardless of whether anyone else likes it, benefits from it, or approves of it. Now, my trauma happened in college. Before college, I had a happy life. I had a really happy childhood. I didn't experience any trauma for the first 18 and a half years of my life. So I know what it feels like for me to not be traumatized. And I have a good understanding of how I would respond to things if my trauma hadn't happened. So a lot of people say that they feel guilty for having to say no. While I know this is a common experience, I never used to relate. Before my trauma happened, I didn't feel any guilt at all for saying no to people. My trauma involved a lot of pressure and social shaming for saying no, which is why I started to have a harder time with it. Recovery for me means going back to feeling zero guilt for saying no. And that can have a negative impact on people who benefited from me saying yes and from doing things that I didn't really want to do. I grew up with unconditional love, and I had unconditional self esteem before my trauma happened. My self worth was inherent, and it was not connected to anything that I did. Sure, I'd feel proud of accomplishments, and I'd feel good if I made someone else feel good, but none of that stuff was connected to my self worth. My trauma experience caused me to define my self worth by things that I did. I ended up basing my self worth on being a good friend, being there for people when they needed me, and being validating. And while I certainly value all of those things, I never wanted my self esteem to be based on them. For years, I felt like if I wasn't there for everyone all the time, then I didn't have a value to anyone. I saw myself as inherently undesirable, like no one would want me as a friend, and I had to overcompensate for that by making sure that I was there for everyone all the time, even when it meant putting my own needs on hold. When you base your self worth on something that you do, the way you do that thing is going to be so much different than if you feel like it's not connected to your self worth. And once you finally sever that connection, once you say, I value this, but my value as a person isn't based on it, the way that you do it will be different. And the people who benefited from you doing it like your self worth depended on it are going to be disappointed. And that is okay. It's your recovery, not theirs. Finally, I made a webinar series when the pandemic first started to help people get through the pandemic. I took all those videos down because I never really wanted to make them in the first place. That entire webinar series was a trauma response. When 2020 began, I had a plan for what I wanted to put on my professional channel, and I wanted to follow through with that plan. I never wanted to create content where I talked about the pandemic at all. I didn't even want to mention it in passing. It was important to me to continue doing what I had planned, and my online content was one of the few areas where I could have done exactly what I had planned to do in 2020. But I felt an immense amount of social pressure to talk about the pandemic because that's what everyone else was doing on their platforms. I felt obligated to address the pandemic on my channel, not a moral obligation, but an obligation that came completely from social pressure. I know that a lot of people may have experienced this same pressure, and this for me is a trauma response. It's because of my trauma that I feel so much fear, guilt, and shame for going against what I feel like I'm supposed to do. Before my trauma happened, I would have felt perfectly fine continuing on with what I had wanted to put on my channel, even if everyone else was talking about the pandemic instead. The reason I bring this up is that even though the webinar series may have been helpful to people, I still wish I hadn't done it because I did it out of fear, guilt, and shame rather than out of a true desire. Sometimes other people will benefit from your trauma responses, and it's still okay to recover. It's still okay to work on being the person you want to be, even if it's not who anyone else wants you to be. Your recovery journey is your own, and if other people don't like it, do it anyway.